Hey everybody, it's Book of Katherine, and we are back for Sermon on the Mount Explained, Part 6. Let's head on over to Matthew chapter 6. We just finished the Lord's Prayer, and so now we're going into verses 14 and 15. Here we go. In prayer, there is a connection between what God does and what you do. You can't get forgiveness from God, for instance, without also forgiving others. If you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part. So Jesus just said that there's a connection between what God does and what you do, which means that it's not just one of those things where, okay, you accept Jesus and then that's it. Like, that's a lie that we're being told, is that we're totally forgiven. All of us are forgiven, but we're not going to actually know the Lord, walk with Jesus, or do very well on Judgment Day, because all of us are going to be judged. Absolutely everyone's going to be going before the judgment throne. And like I said, that's described in the books of remembrance. Sort of this kind of overreaching to give you an idea of what it will be like. Well, it's not just going to be like, oh, you said that you were a Christian, you accepted the forgiveness of Jesus, and then your life didn't change at all. Oh, okay, so that's it. You just walked on and said, I accept the forgiveness. That's actually not how it works at all. What Jesus is saying here is, you may say you want forgiveness, but did you change? Did you start forgiving others? And I can understand why that is. What I've learned more than anything, I just added boundaries to the list. If you go on bookofkatherine.com, totally unrelated to the movies or the books, for my fantasy novels, like that's Book of Katherine movie or Book of Katherine book.com. So my original website that's just my own, that I control and that I write on, that's bookofkatherine.com. And I have a bookshelf on there of texts that have changed my life, or that I have on, that I use all the time in my research. And the number one thing that really set me free from being raised in a very evil household was the book Boundaries. And all it does is go through the boundaries that the Lord sets and says, are you mimicking the Lord and having those same boundaries in your life? And for example, one of the best, and Jesus is saying to do the exact same thing here. Okay, the Lord forgives others. So are you going to have a life that you forgive others? And of course, I don't think that it's possible to really do that very easily without knowing the Lord, or at least walking next to him. And it's very hard to forgive others if you've never been forgiven. It's easy to forgive others when you love them. Like, family members are easier to do. But there's also a thing of like pushing down things and becoming bitter. That's not forgiving. Or staying with the person because of your own selfish gratification. Say that you stay with someone, you say you keep forgiving a boyfriend and you're staying with them, but really you haven't forgiven them at all. Your bitterness is mounting up, but you stay with them because you're scared to go out on your own, and all these things that you'll lose in your life that are, you can't find anywhere else. And so we're talking true forgiveness here, which is seeing people from the eyes of the Lord. That's what it takes to really forgive people, is see them the way the Lord sees them. And by doing so, you end up understanding the mind of God better. We're not naturally able to understand the mind of the Lord. And by trying to forgive others, that requires trying to look at them with new eyes and see them the way the Lord sees them. And that does not mean, I need to be very clear about this. If you read the book Boundaries, this was one of the biggest lessons, because the Catholic Church taught me, forgive others and put up with their abuse. And that is not actually what the Lord does. That's very different. Forgiving is one thing. You can forgive people, but that does not mean that you don't change your behavior. This is said right in here. He says, if you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part. So the Lord does not approach and stay close to us unless we seek him. That's why Jesus says, seek ye first the kingdom of God. It's up to us. When we're interested to hear from the Lord, then we hear from the Lord. I have talked to so many of my friends who end up wanting to talk to the Lord. And I can tell you right now, like, I think through them all, there's all different ways that people talk to the Lord when they finally come to him and listen. I am telling you right now, there are some people who instantaneously heard from the Lord when they did exactly what Jesus said, as we went over earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, which is they went to a secluded spot and they just listened for the Lord. And then the Lord immediately talked to them. And then they just walked and talked with the Lord forever. Like they've just never stopped. And they've barely asked me any questions. They ask the Lord questions all the time. So then there are others that are like, I'm not hearing him. Like they think they're doing something wrong. But I know them very well. And, I only talk about that stuff with people who are very close with me. And they're not really interested. They're just feeling like in hearing from him. They're just doing it because everyone around them is doing it or talks about talking to the God, and they don't want to be left out, or their ego is so big, or they think they know everything. And it's very hard to like lay down your crown, which is what needs to happen in order to hear the Lord, because he's not going to show up if you're not interested in hearing the Lord, the creator of the universe. I guess you'll understand when you try to talk to the Father. It is a very different disposition that you need, because I guess it's just being vulnerable. That's really what it comes down to. It doesn't mean you have to slash yourself on your back. That's not what the Lord wants at all. He went through great pain so that you don't get lashed on your back, so that you don't shed blood, and that you don't shed anybody else's blood in the forgiveness of your sins. He went after death. He wants to give us life. Anyway, so my point in saying all of this is that there's this kind of spoken word out there in the general population of Christianity that if you choose Jesus and if you choose to be saved, if you pursue God and you choose to be saved, then you don't have to do anything. That's it. He died on the cross. That's all you need. And it's not actually true. If you do that, you'll be one of the Christians who gets to the throne of God, and he'll say, I never knew you. He's like, you have to get to know me. That's yes, I've paved the way so that you can be in my presence. Let me be very clear about this, because people are going to be like, oh no, you're saying you have to do works. Well, let me break down how it goes. Because I understand I understand that that's a very easy place to go. Sometimes when I do things, I'm like, oh, but I'm saying it's works because I battle this out in my head because I'm talking to you guys about this now and I argue it. But I argue in my head all the time because I'm in so much pain and it's very easy to get bitter. And then I have to be like, oh, zoom out. That takes a lot of arguing for me to do in my head. Thank goodness I wouldn't wish this on anyone. So thankfully, I don't know of any cases that have what I have as severe as I have. I haven't heard of anyone yet. I hope there really isn't anyone out there like that. So, anyway, hold on. So here is what Jesus did. This is what he did with the cross. This is much more accurate. This is exactly what. So if you go through the ancient Jerusalem, and the reason why the Lord has preserved those texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the text from the first temple, is because we end up learning a lot about ancient Israel and also what Jesus did. For example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls contained all the directions, the original directions for the tabernacle that the Lord gave Moses. So what happened is that if you read the book of Adam, the first book of Adam and Eve, you learned that the Lord used to walk and talk with Adam and Eve, and then there was the fall, and then Adam and Eve had a very hard time not talking to the Lord anymore. And when I read that, I kind of understand their pain, because I haven't even thought about not being able to talk to the Lord anymore. I can't even, I could not, the darkness starts to come in again. This horrible feeling of depression comes in again when I think about not talking with him again. That's the only thing that gets you through the dark days and the dark nights, is that there's always this light and love, consistent knowledge that you're loved and that your Father is right there next to you. That never goes away, no matter how bad things get. So the thing is that Adam and Eve lost that. They lost the ability to talk to the Lord. And, Adam starts committing suicide. He can't live with that. And I can understand that. He goes from, if you read the book of the Cave of Treasures, you see how much was lost there. So anyway, then the Lord doesn't walk and talk. He walks with the prophets like he walked with Enoch and he walked with Adam. But then what happens is that, the people fall as soon as Adam dies, about 950 years old. It's not very long after that society just falls in. You read about it in the book of Enoch. Society just completely gets trashed. And so just 1,000 years after the fall, they have the flood. And so right after the flood, the Nimrod rises and does all these evil things. It's like all their, parents and grandparents, they know that the flood happened. They see it all around them. That's not a question in their mind, and they just go right back to it. It's rather remarkable how quickly that happened. The Tower of Babel and having to spread humanity across the world. It's a tyrant king just rose up so quickly. It tells us a lot about humanity and our nature. So what we don't see the Lord actually, he walks and talks with Abraham, but eventually the Lord rises up a kingdom. That's what he promised Abraham. He said, because of you, I'm actually going to provide a kingdom so that, you don't have to individually walk and talk with me. I'll actually rise a nation where the God of that nation will be me, and where your high priest will be able to actually interact with me, and I will be with them. And even though Israel, pisses on that gift over and over again and turns Solomon's temple into an Egyptian temple and turns the Herod's temple into this big marketplace, in a big buying and selling place instead. And then Zerubbabel's temple, they build it super, super tiny, almost like an afterthought. They're just more interested in getting trade going on King's Road. Even the Lord does all of that. He still has a tabernacle in there. That's the house of the Lord. And this is really important to remember because we live in this world that's been Christianized. So we see these Christian churches on every corner, and we kind of take it for granted that that wasn't always around. It used to be where no nation on earth had anything dedicated to Yahweh anywhere. There was just one tabernacle, one church, if you want to call it, where you could come and meet God in person. And even then, in that tabernacle, which was down in Palestine, in Israel, down there in Palestine, even then, not everyone could go in. That's why I say they didn't used to have weekly services. That they only had 7 festivals a year. Again, the number 7. I talked about that in the Lost Laws of the Lord. I think it was part 3 about the numbers, the holy numbers. The number 7 is also in Leviticus 25, and the book of Jubilees is based on it. The whole Jubilee system is based on the number 7. But not only that, but nature is based on the number 7. Every 7th year, all of our trees across the globe take a rest. They actually kind of die away and take their own Sabbath. So even nature itself does this kind of hibernation on the 7. And so it's not just that the world was created in a set of 7 and that we were given a grace period of a set of 7. 7s are just everywhere. And so there were 7 festivals that the Lord gave them. That's how often everyone gathered to the tabernacle. But even then, they didn't go inside this tabernacle. Instead, there were high priests that would come and take their offerings and burn it. And they had this set. And there were like 3 different things they had to do, that these high priests had to do to enter into the tabernacle, which was kind of like a church today or a temple today. And then they walked in, they did these 3 ceremonies when they worked at the tabernacle. And then the 3 ceremonies were totally mirrored by Jesus. And he fulfilled this, the way, the truth, and the life. That's why he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Those who lived in Israel at the time would have understood that because they were going to the tabernacle. They were going to the temple, Solomon's temple or Herod's temple or Zerubbabel's temple, or before that, Moses's tabernacle. All of those had within them this. They had an altar outside, and then they had water inside. They had all these steps to go in, where one high priest would finally do all this purification and then enter what's called the Holy of Holies, this big curtain, and then they could go inside of it and actually finally be in the presence of God. And that's why the Levites were set aside. They had to live in tents because the Lord said, well, you have to live in tents because you You get to be in the Lord's presence. No one else gets to be in the Lord's presence. And so by birthright, these Levites, this one tribe of Judah, this one tribe of Jacob, they were actually given the ability to go into the presence of God. But if you read the Gospels, and even you read the Sanhedrin and the Yoma from the Jewish times, like read Yoma 9b, it talks about the fact that they couldn't close the temple doors after the curtain was split. So that's why things like the Mormon temple crack me up, because they have this big curtain that mimics the actual tabernacle of Moses and Solomon's temple. And then they have their followers do all of these things before they can actually get inside and past that curtain. And I can see why people do it, because they think, okay, this is all in the law of Moses and the Lord's just doing it. The problem is that, that curtain was literally ripped when Jesus died, and this huge ripping happened. And the reason that is because the ultimate sacrifice was given. All these sacrifices of the goat and the 7 things, all of those were done away with when Jesus ripped that curtain. It means forevermore a sacrifice worthy enough to have ended the need for that cursed curtain has been made. And not only that, but we read in the Yoma 9b, we read in the Jewish records of that time from Rabbi Zakkai, we read that the doors are open. Rabbi Zakkai actually says, remember I said he followed Jesus around and he heard everything Jesus had to say. So Rabbi Zakkai even said, I know you're bound for destruction. He says that to the temple. He's like, you're so disobedient. You keep opening up your doors. He's like, I know you're set down for destruction. And so that's how he was able to exit the city, is because he was the one that was sent by the Rabbi Hillel to go spy on Jesus. And that gave Zakkai a huge advantage. He chose anyway, I could go into the whole history of that, of the mirroring of previous events with the ark and things like that. But so my point is that yes, okay, the temple, and what happened is that the curtain was ripped and the temple doors were opened, and that meant the Spirit of God that was inside the Holy of Holies, where the texts were and where the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there anymore, but it was buried in the caves and to be protected from Babylon, but they still went through the purification and they were able to still meet with the Spirit of God. That was their part. And the thing is that just because the curtain was ripped and the doors were opened does not mean, it means the Holy Spirit went across the world, but you still have to, verbatim, you have to metaphorically still go into the Holy of Holies. The Lord, through Jesus, paved the way, made it available to everyone, not just the Levites. And by the way, when I talk to rabbis, sometimes rabbis call me these academics that are high up in the Jewish architecture of the day, of the secular Jews. So when they call me and sometimes they're upset with what I'm doing, and then I just talk them through it. I'm like, you know exactly what happened. I know you want to be the chosen people, but I know that Isaiah, you love Isaiah. You've built this whole entire thing they built a huge museum in Israel to the Isaiah scroll. They have this big monument to it. Look it up, the Isaiah Scroll Museum or the Isaiah Scroll Israel, and you'll find this huge museum where they take the big scroll out of the Dead Sea Scrolls and they have everyone be able to come and see it. But only if you come to Israel can you come and see this Dead Sea Scroll from Isaiah. Well, they highly value that prophet, but they just happen to leave some things out that maybe make the Jews look like they're no longer the chosen people. Of course, they're still the chosen people. They were chosen for the Messiah to come through their bloodline. But it doesn't mean that they're still the chosen people, only God shows up in them. That's not true at all. And Isaiah says that very clearly. He says repeatedly, the Lord says through Isaiah that he will eventually come to all nations and rule all nations. He's constantly telling them, I'm not just going to be here in Israel for the rest of the days. I'm going to go out amongst the people. Hell, all the way back with the book of Adam and Eve, the Lord actually says at 5.5 days, 5,500 years, I'm going to send someone to restore us and restore this Garden of Eden. and this relationship between you and I, where I can walk with everyone again. But we have to choose to walk with him. We have to choose to actually accept that Jesus has done the way, the truth, and the life, all the steps of that purification, the tabernacle, for us, so that we can walk into the Holy of Holies. That's what Jesus has done. He has provided he's provided the blood. He's the blood of the Lamb. You don't understand that today, because it's been 2,500 years since we've had to do any kind of killing to purify our sins. Only witches and druids and pagans do that sort of thing, where they offer up, well, actually, most Christianity does. They offer tithings to kind of get into good with God, or get forgiveness with God, or get money from the Lord, or to get his favor. We have to do all these things. And pagans used to offer blood. That's the original Valentine's Day, which is coming up here tomorrow. Valentine's Day, some people are like, oh, it's a pagan festival. I'm like, no, we no longer whip the legs of people running through the streets so that blood can flow down the white marble of the city. Like, no. The fact that today we just celebrate love, and that we celebrate each other, and we celebrate the fact that, oh, who do I love around me? The fact that we celebrate love at all without blood is the miracle. It's the sign that the millennium of Christ has come. And it's why George Soros and the Death Eaters, the people who serve Satan and the deceiver, that's why they war against Valentine's Day so much. If it really was a pagan festival, then why in the world would those who worship Satan actually say, we want to take Valentine's Day out of the school? There's nothing, like, why would they want to take a day where you turn around to the students in your class and you say, peace. Peace be with you. I have no beef against you. That's good for kids who are constantly at war, constantly in chaos, constantly petty. That's just our nature. Unless we're trained out of it, then we totally turn into the death in us. We stop being the Lord's children, and we start following the death that's in our bodies that we inherited from Adam and Eve. And kids are constantly on that mode. Why not have one day where they actually focus on the life on us, the love in us, our ability, what makes us different from the sin in us that goes to war with the evil in us. So anyway, what the Lord is saying here in verse 14 through 15, there's a connection between what God does and what you do. You can't get forgiveness from God, for instance, without also forgiving others. He's saying, like, what do you think you're going to do? You're just going to walk into the temple and say, oh, I accept all this forgiveness, the blood that's covered me to come in here and to be in your presence. But, I'm just going to keep acting like I'm not forgiven. I'm not going to let that transform my life at all. Like, what are you going to have in common with the Lord? What are you going to have to talk about? How are you ever going to get to know him? The fact of the matter is that we have the basics of Isaiah haven't changed. The Lord tells Israel, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Human ways are not my ways. So how do we get to know them? Well, one of the things is start behaving like the Lord. And so one of those is to start forgiving people. That is different from actually staying with them. If people are being evil, if they are mean and cruel, the Lord doesn't stay around them. Like, the Lord separates back. And that's one of the biggest lessons I learned in boundaries, was they were just outlining all the ways the Lord actually behaves. And one of those is that the Lord steps back. They said, they put this very good analogy. They said, look, stay as far away, create a distance to protect your love for that person. So let's say it's a sibling. Okay, let's say one of my siblings, like, my siblings reacted very differently when I started distancing myself from my parents, who were highly, highly abusive. Some of my siblings were like all in, like, okay, I've seen what they did to you. I've been a witness to it. Go get yours. Yeah. And then other siblings were like, how could you ever do this? You need to accept it. And so what I realized is that I had to follow the rule of the boundaries, which is, okay, if I stick around this sibling, and get on the phone with them like I used to do all the time and just hear constant abuses from them, well, the Lord wouldn't do that. He doesn't stick around a person who constantly abuses him. He starts distancing himself. And what they said is that distance yourself enough to the point where you protect your love for them. So I started noticing, like, if I started putting off my sibling and like not calling every day or not calling every week, and I started to notice, like, okay, I distanced myself a little more, a little less time with them, little less time with them. And there came this point where I found the moment where I had a balance of, oh, I feel like instead of being bitter at them or being angry at them, that they've done all this to me or that they're constantly abusing me. Then I get to this point where I'm like, right, okay, I love you. And I was able to see them much more clearly. And that meant that I wasn't able to be in their presence as much, but I was able to love them and forgive them. And it wasn't this like huge struggle. And I was able to be a much, much better sibling to them by far. It was so hard. Today, I don't think I would know the Lord as well. I wouldn't be able to hear the Lord's voice if I hadn't actually put that distance in. But isn't that what the Lord does? I just finished telling you about how the Lord's like, you have to come to me. So I did a really interesting thing in the end with my sibling, this particular sibling I'm talking about. I actually was like, you know what? They said something really, really, like really bad. And it wasn't one of those off the cuff. When people vent, like only like 10% of what they said or 1% of what they say is actually true. The rest of it is just venting. And so you have to find out what was true and actually deal with that. And so you just kind of like, you can't believe they meant absolutely everything that they said when they vented. And so that just kind of, it means it was pent up after a long, long time. And so I checked after they said some things and I was like, okay, is this actually like, what's the kernel of truth in everything you said? And they were just like, all of it. And they already knew what I was talking about because we had talked about this before. And I realized that, okay, this is really bad. Like, this is a meaningful ugliness, and it will not just continue, but it will get worse. And so what I did was I talked to the Lord about what to do, and he's like, wait for them to call you back. And so I did that. And we used to speak multiple times a week. But then I just did this thing where I just waited for them to call me back instead. I was like, and I couldn't believe it because they never called me back. I had not even been aware of the fact that I kept pursuing them. I kept calling them. I didn't even know that. And the moment I didn't call them, they didn't call me back. And I say like, I don't know if I ever would have noticed that, but all this stuff in my head was like, make peace with your siblings and It turned out that not calling them was making peace with my sibling, because they didn't actually, if they had wanted to be in my presence or talk with me, they would have called me, wouldn't they? And it went on for years. Same thing with my family. The same thing happened with my parents. So and that's why I say, like, I can relate to Jesus so much, because my friends and family today, it is very painful when we are out of each other's presence. Like, it is not fun. None of us like it. If there's a large separation of time, it is hell on all of us. And they call me just as much as I call them. There's this whole new world that I don't know if I know I never would have found any of them if I had not mirrored how the Lord operates, which is, okay, you don't want me, you don't want to spend time with me. Okay, you don't have to spend time with me. I'm not going to go hound you. I'm not going to go chase after you. I'm going to wait until you actually want to talk to me. And then it's like a mutual thing. This is the exact same thing right here. He's saying in prayer, there's a connection between what God does and what you do. If you forgive others, then if you walk with the Lord and he is forgiving you, and then you forgive others, then you're able to be closer to the Lord, because if you want to chase God, one of the best ways you can chase God is to actually, treat others the way he sees them. There's more for you to relate to. And so I did in that thing with my siblings. Didn't I just totally do the same thing? I have no more animosity towards any of my siblings or anyone in my family. Like, there's no animosity left. It is, I don't even know if I could call it forgiveness. I just feel this overwhelming amount of love and joy and abundance when it comes to my family. Yes, there's a deep and sharp pain of the separation, but I so want them to do well. I so want the absolute best for them. I'm way past forgiveness. I'm well into, like, I just love them so much, just how the Lord loves them. But I had to behave like the Lord in order to actually get there and forgive them and go past forgiveness and love them with joy and abundance and just this tinge of sorrow. And do you think they've drawn close to the Lord? That's up to them. It's not my job to make them draw close to the Father. It's my job to draw close to the Father. And one of the best ways you can do that is to behave like the Lord and learning to forgive others and working on forgiving others. It's not the same thing as saying yes to abuse. The Lord does not say yes to abuse. When Israel rejected the Lord, he tore them down. He absolutely, completely tore them down. He took a long time to do it, but it's not like he was like, oh, you can just keep abusing me. Please, yes, go ahead and write. He outlines 3 gods that they were worshiping at the time. He did everything that he could. Mirror that. You know what I mean? Like, mirror that. That's what Jesus is saying. He's like, if you refuse, quote, if you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part. Absolutely. If you refuse to actually let him be your father and let him teach you how to walk and talk and teach him, if you refuse to let him teach you his ways, of course you're cutting yourself off from him. Absolutely. All right, so on to verse 18. Verse 16. Quote, when you practice some appetite-denying discipline to better concentrate on God, don't make a production out of it. What they mean is appetite-denying discipline. So that means fasting. Like, fasting was a thing. It's still a thing today, fasting. In the Catholic Church in Lent, they do this thing where for 40 days you give up something that you love and you practice something that's appetite-denying. But what he's saying is, if you're doing that, if you're fasting or if you're giving up something to better concentrate on the Lord, he says, don't make a production out of it, which is, let's continue on. He says, quote, it might turn you into a small-time celebrity, but it won't make you a saint. If you go into training inwardly, act normal outwardly. I can tell you from experience that it's very hard to do. Right? That's very, very hard to do. It's very hard if you go on a fast to actually not tell people about it. I remember when I was part of a church, the people who went on fast, everybody knew they were on a fast. They told everybody about it, and then they'd be invited to speak, and then they do this tour of telling people about fasting and what it did for them. Yeah, that actually goes directly against what the Lord says. He's like, yep, you no one should know about it. Like, it's supposed to be between you and the Lord. And he says, it might turn you into a small-time celebrity. That's going on a speaking tour. That's everybody knowing how holy you are. That's not anything to do with the Lord. He says it won't make you a saint. That doesn't make you a saint. That makes you someone that didn't actually read what Jesus said, the very first speech he ever gave. Quote, if you go into training inwardly, act normal outwardly. He said, shampoo and comb your hair, brush your teeth, wash your face. The reason he's saying to do that, shampoo and comb your hair, brush your teeth, wash your face, he's not saying you have to specifically do those things. What he's saying is that people back then who went into fast or did all these things, a perfect example, when Pilate wrote about coming to Judea to be the governor for Judea, the first thing he wanted to do was put in an aqueduct and provide an ability for people to live longer, prevent disease. When Caesar Augustus made peace with Rome, as Jesus put it, when Caesar Augustus made peace with Rome, he set up a system of taxation. Well, that meant that instead of warring and conquering and killing off their people, and instead looking into taxation and kind of like keeping peace so that there are no rebellions, it was their way of preventing any rebellions was to instead just tax people. Instead of saying you have to change this or change that, just tax them. And what that meant is that, well, put in aqueducts so that people don't die. If more people live and if the empire thrives, then there's more people to tax and they make more money. So they came in to make this aqueduct system, and the people of Jerusalem, he said he'd never seen a more diseased, more scrawny looking, more dirty people ever. But they were proud of that. They were proud and they were showing off how holy they were. They're like, well, we love the Lord and we don't give into things like washing our face or doing, taking care of our sanitation. And that's one of the reasons that Jesus was so controversial. He went around healing people, but he was also saying, prevent yourself against disease, fight for your life, wash your hair, stay clean. Don't roll around in the mud and never take a shower just to show everybody else how pious you are. I mean, even John the Baptist, he may have lived in the desert, but he was constantly in the water. He was constantly in the water, staying clean. He avoided disease. He went towards life. That's not to say to go the extreme, which is like the Third Reich, which is cleanliness. Anytime you see a house that's absolutely pristine and they have kids and they have pets and the house is absolutely meticulous and immaculate, that's not a good sign. That means the attention and the focus is on presentation instead of on inward character. He's saying, do the basics, take care of yourself. But if you decide to go into something and walk with the Lord and do something that helps you better focus on the Lord and how much the Lord can do in your life, no one else should know about it. He said, act normally, so that he says, quote, God doesn't require attention-getting devices. He won't overlook what you're doing. He'll reward you well. Jesus has to say this because it's so easy. It's so easy to forget about the walk after this life. It's so easy to forget that our souls will go on. It's so easy to be out of Eden and focus on all that we've lost and don't have here on this earth. Everyone keeps promising us utopias. That's the Saul Alinsky. He did a dedication to Lucifer. He was like, before we go on in this book, the last book he wrote, which ironically, he died after he wrote a book that said, let's go ahead and acknowledge Lucifer, the first rebel who won his own kingdom. And that's a total lie. He lost everything. But in that book, Saul Alinsky is like, this is for every radical. He says, radicals are people who can imagine a better world and want to fight to make it happen. Yeah, that's almost every political machine today. They actually follow this guy who was like, let's follow Lucifer. Let's follow his example. And that's why, he came up in the 1960s, 1950s, and 60s. And almost every community in America, after preaching this rules for radicals of following Lucifer and trying to win for a better kingdom, every city has turned to dust. Now you can live a much more healthy life outside of the USA. There's tent cities everywhere. There's no updated buildings. I mean, it is just trashed. Almost everywhere in the USA that this sort of rules for radicals has been taught or followed with people who have tried to make a utopia world that they thought would be better and try to bring it into existence. It's resulted in absolute catastrophe, death, and disease. Joblessness rates, terrible living, squalid conditions, squalid landlords. And that's because the utopia that we should be focusing on, or the one that will reward you with good things in this world, is when you realize this world isn't going to last. There's going to be a judgment throne. There's going to be another world. And you invest in that one, which is why he continues on. Jesus is saying, I know that it's going to be hard, but the Lord will reward you well. He will reward you well. So that's verse 19. He literally goes into this next. Quote, don't hoard treasure down here where it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, or worse, stolen by burglars. So this is a very, very famous saying in other translations, which is keep your treasures, in heaven. Build your treasure in heaven. Your treasure is in heaven, not on earth. And my illness has kind of forced this into me. And also the road trip that I did, that I told you guys about, the going around the world. That road trip, when I came home, I threw almost everything we had out. So everything in my home now, nearly every single thing, if it isn't something from a medical piece of equipment, it has absolutely to do with something that the Lord had us buy on one of our adventures. He would walk and talk with us through a store, and then he'd get us something as a gift. So that each thing is like a gift from the Father. But I know that, the Father in person, being closer to the Father without this body, being able to feel him and being in his presence fully, all three, Father, Son, and Ghost, to do that is way better than this gift. So the gift is just a reminder. So when I look around my room, I see all these reminders of what's coming. So on the other flip side, you watch that the Hunters show on Amazon Prime. It's this show about how the war between, two Jewish factions after the Holocaust, the pure Jewish race in the Ashkenazi race, and then the other Jews who were persecuted because they had some tainted blood or whatever, and were willing to deal with the outside world and not just Germany. There's this big war between the two. And so when they rounded everyone up, like the Nazis, when they rounded everybody up, they had all this treasure. And the second faction in New York, they find this treasure, well, what's considered treasure down here, they find it underneath this big bank in the USA. And they're just in awe. And I looked at it, and I see this big, huge, long warehouse of things that the Nazis stole. And they're just going through it like it's some holy museum. And I started laughing, and I wouldn't have laughed before, but I've been through so much illness, and I've been studying what Jesus says, and I'm much closer. I don't know. The things of this world seem funny to me now, if that makes sense. And the reason I laughed is because I saw that, and what I saw was the curses on the Nazis for stealing it. Jesus says, or even worse, stolen by burglars. That is not good for that is a huge curse, and they suffered that curse. They had their entire land stolen. They had to evacuate to South America on the other side of the world from their precious Germany. They could never go back to Germany. They had to stay far, far away from Germany. And so it's fascinating to me because they were like, oh, all these things stolen. And that's if your treasure is on earth. If it matters so much, like we see documentaries on a painting stolen by the Nazis. Let them have it. Like Jesus says, like, give generously, give them your coat. Just be like, you want that? Here, take it. It's a curse upon them. Heap the curse upon them for taking it. Be like, here, take it. It doesn't matter. Like, that's exactly what happened when he says that it was easy. He says when it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, everything in that giant warehouse, even though it was all this gold and jewelries and mess, it was all rusted. It was totally broken down, and, it had been 70, 50 years since, 40 years since the Holocaust, and here they are opening it, and it's all this rusted stuff, and they're like, oh, these are the cufflinks that my grandma gave me this, or this is the ring that gave me. So, like, haven't you seen old rings? Like, vintage rings, they like, in some ways, there's a good reason to be worried about vintage rings because you don't know what's attached to it from the people who had it before. Remember, if you do something evil in this world, it leaves a scar on this earth, and it leaves a scar on the things that you're wearing. If it's bad enough, like I don't want to be 50 feet near anything the mafia has touched. Like, I don't want to have the tie that they own. I don't want to have the rings that they own. I don't want anything, whatever they touched. That I don't want that kind of crap near me. Like, no way. So Jesus is saying, don't hoard treasure down here where it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, or worse, stolen by burglars. Stockpile your treasure in heaven where it's safe from moth and rust and burglars. It's obvious, isn't it? The place where your treasure is the place you will most want to be and end up being. I cannot emphasize that enough. The Lord talks about, like, right now, why are people still here instead of the New Jerusalem? Like, clearly people have left the Magic Kingdom at Disneyland. Their Disneylands had a record in 2019. They had a record 500 million people, over 517 million people attend Disney Park, I believe, in Anaheim. That's a massive amount. Like, that's 500 million people. It dropped 99.3%. 99.7%, something like that. Over 99% loss. And then you could say, oh, well, that was the COVID restrictions. Really? They reopened, and it only bounced up to 8 million at its top in 2020. Like, that's the highest. That's still a reduction of, what was it, 96 or 97%? Like, where did all those people go? I remember I've been to Disneyland. I went there as an adult. I knew plenty of people because they lived down in Anaheim. I knew so many people who had an annual pass. They went there and Disneyland because it was paradise compared to what was going around them in California. Like Disneyland had a lot of rules. Like there's so much rules. They checked you for weapons before you came in. It was basically a safe place to go until midnight every night, which, if there's no park in California, no national or state park in California that you can go, you can't, in California, it's not safe. Well, when I left, it wasn't safe to be out at night. Once the sun went down, when dusk came, you don't go outside. If you do, you better be in a good car, and you better be in a safe neighborhood, and you better know what you're doing. You better be really prepared for anything that could go down, right? In California, unless you went to Disneyland. So in a way, people are going there. It's called the Magic Kingdom. Well, the Lord's offering a new kingdom. And from all the text that it says, it appears from what I'm seeing that it's for the 3.5 years. The 3.5 years they talk about for a rapture, but it makes more sense. Exactly what Jesus is saying here. All these portrayals that Hollywood does by the people who hate Jesus and hate Christians, they're all making fun of the rapture, saying they're just going to be instantly zapped up. Nope, Jesus is specifically saying you have to go to the Lord. No one is going to get zapped up for a rapture. They're going to have to go pursue the new earth. And it's very clear that clearly some have, especially if nearly 500 million, at least in the California area. And so if 500 million had gone to another part of the USA, are you kidding? Like that would have been it. There's already been a huge exodus from California, but that started all the way back in 2010. Like the 2010 census found that a massive, massive portion had already left. I believe the migration out of California had begun around the year 2002, 2003, 1996. A slow and steady migration, but people moving to California were actually offsetting it, but then they were leaving again. I couldn't believe how many people, when I did some readings of the book here on the East Coast, I was invited and I went to a certain place to do some readings, and everyone there had lived in California and had just moved back. They'd gone and then they left. And that's so the people that are in California, it's a totally separate thing. My point is that that's just one little piece that we know that people are leaving. But there's no way that there's like this zapping up where it's going to be like, what's that Left Behind series where they just had folded clothes on an airplane? No, like it's never going to be like that. If we have to ask the Lord and go into a secluded spot to actually listen to the Father, doesn't it make sense that you'd have to go off and seek ye first the kingdom of God? That's a hint. You're supposed to go seek out the New Jerusalem, right? So he says the place where your treasure is the place you most want to be and end up being. Who are the people who haven't? Like, I can guarantee you there are people who are attached to this earth or attached to death. And they're staying because their actual treasure is their kid, or their treasure is their parents, or their treasure is their home, or their treasure is their job, or their treasure is their clout, or their treasure is their Louis Vuitton, and they can't imagine being someplace where there isn't Louis Vuitton, or their treasure is their power, or their treasure is their nation. I think that's what happened. That's what the entire Trump election was about, the entire 2020, all the things that happened between I think that was a very clear thing for people in the USA who believed in USA as if that was their God. It completely was like, the Lord was like, nope, made it very clear what you're worshiping, that this incredibly fallen state. Do not worship your nation. That is not what you should worship, nor is it what you should pursue, So, this is so important. The place where your treasure is the place you most want to be and end up being. That's exactly what we read about in the Book of Remembrance, is that the only people who end up in the kingdom after the judgment throw are the people who choose it, the people who want to be near the Father, and the people who don't, who are like, I prefer my own way. Those are the people who don't get into the kingdom of the Lord. So totally even more important today. So verse 22. Your eyes are windows into your body. Oh, I love this section right here. Quote, Jesus says, your eyes are the windows into your body. If you open your eyes wide in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a musty cellar. If you pull the blinds on your windows, what a dark life you will have. Okay, so in California, we had a phrase for this. We called it people with a yes face or a no face. So if we ever recommended somebody to go into a library, like people stopped going to libraries because the librarians did the exact, they had it squinty-eyed in greed and distrust. If you can tell just by looking at a person if they have a yes face or a no face. And I learned not long after Boundaries to like, don't go and ask anybody any questions. Don't go up wide-eyed and bushy-tailed and interested and creative and go up to someone and be like, oh, do you have this? They'll abuse you. They're squinty-eyed, they're distrustful, they're angry, they're, little mole rats. Yeah. So I hear, literally, the media today actually attacks anyone who is wide-eyed. They say that those people are stupid, or those people are childish, or those people are dumb. So that's one of the biggest things I know that we face versus city life versus in the urban life. People who are more willing to actually spend time with the earth, they can walk outside and they see the trees and they see the wonder of the Lord and they take pictures of it all and they think it's beautiful. There's a complete opposite side that's dirty, that's living in the dirt, you don't have a Nikon camera. You have a Canon camera. You should have a Nikon camera. Like, there's a big difference in the Nikon community and the Canon community. I've always pushed towards Canon because the Nikon community is so, squint-eyed in greed and distrust. They're so angry. They're so closed. And they're so high and mighty and so hoity-toity, they're not interested in meeting other people. That's not a total rule, but it's not a pleasant community to be around, and so there are people in your life, you can probably easily categorize them by this person is eyes open in wonder and belief, and their body fills up with life. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a musty cellar. That is so hard to do in this world today and not feel like you're going to be exposed and to abuse. And I had to learn that balance of okay, forgive people, but also put distance until I can love them freely and openly and still have wide eyes wonder. I can look back on my family, that's this horrific upbringing, and I can look back with eyes of wonder now, being like, oh, look, I got to do this. 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 I'm so grateful for all of these things. There's a balance to be made of you want to keep your eyes in wonder and distrust. So if someone is telling you and attacks you and makes you kind of withdraw and contract, that's a sign that, they're one of the people who is squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, and they're just always judging. That's you believe them. When people tell you who they are, believe them and act accordingly. The Lord does. The Lord most definitely does. Okay, so verse 24, quote, you can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration for one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. There's a reason that Jesus said that to Judea. They were on King's Road. If you look into they've done studies on the Megiddo, the town of Megiddo, and they find all this pattern of destruction and rebuilding and destruction and rebuilding. And they found 14 levels of cities there. The Lord keeps destroying them and apocalypse happens and they just rebuild. There's so much dedicated destroy. Think about it. If you go into, there's the Jewish sector is the one that absolutely dominates the jewelry. It's very hard to find a jewelry store that is not owned by a Jewish family that goes way, way, way back, right? That's why when you go to New York, the best jewels and the best gems are going to be found in the Jewish section, the absolute best. I've been blessed enough to have learned who the best jewelers are and the absolute best gems, the ones who have the actual best grades, but absolutely every single store is in the Jewish section with a Jewish name. There's a reason that Jesus said this. Like, King Solomon married all these women. The Lord was very clear. He said, do not marry. Like, I'm not saying that just the Jews are like this today. I'm saying this is the reason Jesus said to the Jews back then. So now the whole world is obsessed with trade. This is a lesson for all of us. So, but the Adam Sandler movie, it's a perfect, the guy faced destruction because his whole life was about, the movie was called Gems or something like that. It was all about making the money. And then what does the Lord do? Because your mind is focused on money and you worship money, you worship jewels, you worship gold, then the Lord curses you and you end up gambling and then you lose everything that you have. People just think it's so great to reach the 1% and suddenly start making all this money. But seriously, people just start gambling. Like, the Lord curses you if you're not doing it. If money is what you worship, then it just flows through your fingers. You don't end up keeping it. So he's saying you can't worship God and money both. Loving one, you'll end up hating the other. And so that's absolutely a sign. They ended up killing Jesus, didn't they? This guy that healed. But he was proposing something that went against the money. Like, everything he said, that's why Pilate loved him so much. Pilate was sent to Judea specifically to make sure and put down any rebellion, anyone who could rise up and be a leader of men. He was sent there to stop anyone who was supposed to be a leader of men. Why was he sent there? Because they knew the prophecies were about to be fulfilled. The coin that Caesar had said that he was the light of the world. So he was specifically sent. Caesar was supposed to be the light of the world. So make sure this prophesied one is squashed. And so they sent Pilate, a very dedicated Roman, to go and catch Jesus. But then Jesus kept going after all of the leaders of Jerusalem, and Pilate just loved it too much because the leaders of Jerusalem were so closed-eyed, squinty-eyed, greed and distrust. They caused so many problems. The things that they did to Pilate, it just so... He records them all in detail as he's going along, and it's so just underhanded and bitter and racist. Very, very deeply racist, even though Pilate says that, I think I actually have a bloodline that goes back to Jerusalem because he's part of the Sephardic Jewish tribe, I think, through Spain. So he actually had some Portuguese or whatever blood. He had the Sephardic Jewish bloodline in him, and that didn't matter. It was like you had to be born there, you had to be Jewish, you had to be sacrificing 7 days. And Pilate writes about this venomous racism, and then Jesus goes against the money, and that's it. This guy from Galilee barely ever comes to the temple, but what did they do? Literally, Pilate records this. The moment Jesus goes after their trade, it wasn't even a big deal. It didn't stop the entire market trade. From the Roman and the Jewish records, it says that the scuffle didn't even last very long. Jesus kind of took out a whip and started knocking some, but it was such a scuffle. He didn't knock out he didn't drive the entire trade. Have you seen a 3D, copy of the Stoa that was there in the Temple of Herod? It was a mass. It would have taken at least a day, if not 3 days, to clean it all out, to clean out the entire marketplace. No, Jesus was just teaching. He got upset at the trading in the house of worship. He was like, you're worshiping money. But that was when the Caiaphas and the Jews had been asking for Pilate to arrest Jesus for forever. But Pilate was finally, he actually did something that disturbed people in the marketplace. So he interrupted the trade of money, and he was like, all right, I'll have to go ahead and start surrounding the troops to help go with Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the Jewish police, and go with them and actually arrest them and hold a trial. And so he's like, I can't really, he interrupted the money. That's the point, is that Jesus may have healed a bunch of people, but, they interrupted the money. Perfect example. Jesus actually healed they had these 5 pools in Jerusalem. If you actually read the Gospels, you'll learn that Jerusalem actually had these 5 pools of water that could heal you, that you went into it and you could actually be healed by getting into these pools of water. And that wasn't rare. The fact that we don't think the supernatural exists today is so ridiculous. There's absolutely no There's no evidence for that. That's something that only the Christian population, only the West is actually taught that. Nowhere else in the world do they think that the supernatural or the metaphysical doesn't exist. And so back then they had 5 pools of water that you could get healed in. And there's a man who'd been waiting on the side forever. He was lame. He couldn't walk. He was waiting to get into the pools. And that means that they were, and what happens is, I'm getting ahead of myself, is that Jesus is like, how long have you been waiting? He was like 30 years or 30 days or something like that. And Jesus said, rise and walk up, and he holds down his hands and he gets up the guy and he's like, now walk and be healed. Well, the guy just goes around to, I think Jesus said, and don't tell anyone. But instead, what does the guy do? He goes and tells everyone, and it pisses off the priest so much. It gets Jesus in so much hot water, and they actually come up to them and they're like, what do you think you're doing? Well, why were they angry? It interrupted trade. It meant that you could be healed for free. They had actually, monopolized or monetized the pools. And so only the rich and the wealthy were getting in. And Jesus was like, clearly they're just selling this forever and you're never going to get healed because you're poor. That's what we always find out is the people at all of these pools that can heal. It's only the poor, the lame. And that shows you how cruel the society was, that they'd been sitting on the side lame forever and absolutely no one was like, here, take my place. It shows you how much money was the law of the day. Money goes against life. That's why the Nazis, if you want to look up the Nuremberg trials, look up, it's profitoverlife.org or .net or something, profit-life, like it's all dashes, profitoverlife.org or .net or something like that. And then it breaks down the oil, chemical, and gas and pharmaceutical cartel that was literally convicted as being the architect of the Holocaust. It was actually a chemical firm and a mining firm that actually designed Auschwitz. Like they said that the German camps, the Reich camps, weren't efficient enough at getting through all the people. They said, why don't we combine it all? And they actually drew up the things so that the worst death camps that we know of were actually designed by an international chemical conglomerate. And people are wondering why no one knows about the chemical spill. That was a massive chemical spill that was in Ohio. And then they're like, why isn't it on national news? And I'm like, is any chemical spill ever on national news? Like, they will scream and fight over the smallest things. But then when a chemical spill, no, don't go after the chemical companies. And you will not see a Republican or a Democrat ever say anything about it. They're holding it over Twitter. People have been fired at Twitter. This totally nonsense things, but something that actually affects lives, that is actually killing people. The plume was seen, so a guy made a film 200 miles away. Their skies were blackened out in the middle of the day. Their skies turned black 200 miles away with this chemical spill. And that stuff I can go on and on about it. But my point is that, nope, but we worship money, and there isn't any money in reporting a chemical spill because the one funding everybody are these German chemical corporations and mining corporations. So that's my point, is that, you can't worship God or money. And that, I would say, why do you think churches, these liars, these con artists up there are telling you to donate every week? It keeps your mind on the money. It keeps you making money because that's the only way that you think you can be forgiven by God is if you earn that money and churn it in. And that just serves these misers and these merchants, and every single, it's fascinating. Think about what Hollywood censors. Do you know what I'm saying? Think about all the stories that Hollywood censors. It's incredible to me. We don't really think about the movies that aren't made. The Book of Katherine films. Think about why weren't films like that. Those stories, like the Book of Katherine films, have been around. They've been written. People have written those stories. So why didn't Hollywood make them? What's different this time? What's different in those movies that they don't want out? And it's not just money. That's why Jesus doesn't say it's just you can't worship God and money both. He says you can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. So, if you worship luxury brands, if that's what you worship, you'll end up hating God, the real true God. And that's one of the reasons, if you absolutely think that your self-worth is all about the labels that you own, why would you want to go before the Father? Because why would you go? Because, he's going to see who you really are and your labels mean nothing. It's really what it comes down to. Like, there's people who see fashion, they see the Lord in fashion. Like, I certainly love good fashion. I see the Lord in it. I see the beauty in it, but it can't, a person's character definitely affects what comes out of them. You shall know them by your fruits, said Jesus. And think about that. Like, think about who is actually making the clothing, and whether or not there is an admiration for the one if you watch that one movie like Dior and I, you find out that this guy who is supposedly the head designer, and he goes into this high couture fashion house and he makes this new Dior collection. You find out that he didn't actually design a freaking thing. He didn't design one freaking thing. What he did is he let the couturiers who don't have the glory, who don't have the power, but who love beauty and who love the emergence between chaos and design, and who are not making a ton of money, their joy, those couturiers, their eyes are wide in wonder. And he was like, just do what you want. And then they brought it in, and he'd be like, well, maybe go this way or that way. But he barely even touched these fashions ever. And he was so cool. He made like one of the hardest working women in the organization cry. That's very, very hard to do. But think about the people who attend the fashion shows. Remember when they slapped a woman in the face? Did that gain international headlines? No, they were like, how dare you speak to my mother like that? Trust me, they're not going to be saying, yay, I want to get into heaven. So that tells you where they're going. All right, so I'm over an hour. I love you guys so much. If you don't want heaven, you won't get it. That's the bottom line of this. So we'll have part 7 when I am healthy enough to do it. Thank you, Father, for giving me the health to actually be able to do this recording today. I haven't been able to do it in such a long time. I love you guys so much, and I'll see you on the next one. Oh, by the way, one thing is that if you want to donate, if you want to support, there's a link down below. You could do $1 a month if you want. There's no subscriptions up there. I'll never take anything from anyone automatically. So it's just, whatever you want, whatever amount you want. I don't set any rules or limits. It's just a PayPal link. Do what you want. Every single thing is a blessing. So, and then also is, the second thing is that I began doing Twitter recordings. I've already done 9 episodes. So that's a way for me to use my voice when I have it, but the rest of my body isn't functioning. Like my hands aren't functioning, my arms aren't functioning, my legs aren't functioning. Then in order to do these recordings, I have to be able to sit up. I can do those recordings without sitting up anyway. You don't need to know the reason why. So I have Twitter recordings that are, of course, there's a reason we call it Book of Katherine, on absolutely everything. I have a new page on bookofkatherine.com so that you can just go to the menu and click on Twitter Spaces, and all the recordings will be there so you can listen to the one you want. Also, the length of the recording is there. And then you have a direct link as well as, which episode is which and what day they were taped. So there's a library there. And so if you want to listen on those, you can. There's even one recording of Taz purring late at night. He was such a good kitty. He actually purred. So when the night is really painful, that's one of the ways I get through it. I have cat. The doctor was so right when he said to get a companion animal. I had Tasmanian, there's always at least one cat guarding me, sitting up close at night. And if I'm doing really poorly, they'll just purr, purr, purr. And oh my gosh, that can heal almost anything. So I'm very, very blessed. The Lord, is generous. So, all right, so those Twitter recordings are there. If you want to donate, down below. Oh, right. Well, the movie should be out by the time this reaches you, I think. So I'm not on the PR team or anything like that, but I do know the movie's coming out this week, Book of Katherine and the Mormon Star. I think it's actually the 5th one. I don't know. I made a page about that too. If you want to know about the fantasy fiction world, the Book of Katherine, the Prophet Shirl that you keep hearing, Book of Katherine and the Enchanted Necklace, all of those movies, I actually just made a page about that yesterday as well. My hands were working. My voice wasn't working yesterday. So I was able to actually make that page yesterday, both pages. So if you also go on bookofkatherine.com, which I'll try and leave the link below, if you go there in the menu, there will say Twitter Spaces, but then another menu option will actually be Prophet's Journal, which is what the original Book of Katherine and the Chinese Maze, it was originally called Prophet's Journal, which is why the Twitter handle that I write on in that character is actually at Prophet's Journal. So the whole story of that, as well as every movie and the story behind them all, they're all right there on that one page, so you can find it in one place and find out about the movies if you haven't already. Okay, so that's everything. I love you guys so much. Gone well over an hour. Time to go, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye. Seek him first. Love you.